All right, we are going to talk with a gentleman who has ideas, a gentleman who has solutions, and a gentleman who can take where we are now, put it in a historical context, and tell me what has been done in the past that has worked, and how can we do that now? Dr. Neil Lester from ASU joins us next. Chris Merrill, Newstalk 550 KFYI, East Side, West Side traffic with Lee Powell and Steve.
We do it every Thursday at 6:35. We are Newstalk 550 KFYI.
All right, Newstalk 550 KFYI. One of the paramount duties I think that we have here as a radio station is to try to be a service to the community. Oftentimes, I think that it gets lost as we talk about, are things going right this way, are things going right that way? My opinion matters more than your opinion, but ultimately, I think what I'd like to do, especially in the wake of what's going on here over the last week, is try to find some common ground from which we can all begin and then press forward. And so I've asked one of the ASU professors, Professor Neil Lester, to join me right now. He's a director of Project Humanities and, quite frankly, one of the most accomplished and well-respected guys in the state, in the country. And so Dr. Lester is joining me now. And Dr. Lester, first of all, we've seen these divisions. We've seen these rifts. President Obama says it's not as bad as it was in the 1960s. Now, after the 1960s, we knew that there was a great deal of animosity. What was it after all those things, 1968, 69, and so forth? What was it that sort of simmered down the animosity at the time? Were there solutions found, and can we learn from that today?
Well, for one thing, there were public policies that came as a result of that so that people could not misbehave in ways that they had that sort of led to the civil rights, and I use that word misbehave, recognizing that it's actually quite loaded. So there were public policies that had to do with voting. There were public policies that had to do with discrimination. There were public policies that had to do with the ways in which people could behave publicly that was no longer legal and allowed in ways where people had to be more accountable.
So from that, then, can we take a look and at those policies? And if we look at those policies, were they sufficient? Because here we are, it feels like back in a very similar situation with similar divisiveness.
Right, but I think part of this, though, I mean, when we talked off the air about where do we go from here, I think part of what we have to do is to go back to examine what brought us to the here. Because to imagine that we can sort of start now as though this is a blank slate, we have to figure out what were the things that led here. And that means that we have to go back and sort of tease out some of the nuances of our shared American history. So to imagine, as I hear some people talking, that, oh my gosh, now we're having violence in the world. Violence has been part of our national and world identities. We fought wars. We have, we've enslaved people. So there's no sense that violence, I mean, this shooting, which is tragic, is not the first shooting and the loss of human life around issues that have to do with race, but not just race, but race and economics, race and lack of opportunity. So the question we might ask is, where are we as a nation economically that may lead to some of the division that we see? Where are we in terms of a lack of opportunity and the fact that this is about equity and race and equity and class? So all of these things, and gender. So all of these things have to be looked at, not in a way that we sort of package them and say we left them in the 60s, but what is the residual of where we started as a nation and where we are now? What has changed? How do we measure the progress? I would suggest that we start there, and that means that we have to uncover some things that are not always very pleasant, and that is the reality that racism exists, and that having our first African-American president didn't automatically mean that we were post-racial.
No, I think it showed us maybe just the opposite of that. It actually, I think, emboldened some people to allow their racism to come out. And then from the other side, it made people very angry that racism did exist.
Yes.
Are you observing that too?
Yes, absolutely. And I appreciate the fact that there's an acknowledgement of that. I guess what I'd like to say, though, is that what we see now, which seems to be escalating, is this notion that we can see these things and experience what's happening in the world so much faster than we could have ever imagined, and so much more broadly. And I certainly don't want to discredit social media, but I do think that social media has brought this to the attention. If we were not filming some of these things with technologies, if we were not, live streaming some of this, we wouldn't know about it. The reality is there is corruption at all levels, in all organizations to some degree, and until the corruption, the unfairness, those people who thrive on milking inequities between groups, recognizing that power is associated with that, and the more you can keep groups divided, the more power the person or persons or organization can have over the minds of people who are not thinking critically about this. The reality, as President Obama has said over and over again, is that we may not be able to stop all the evil in the world, and he said this on the occasion of the Tucson tragedy, but how we treat each other is up to us. Mm-hmm. And so I would say that in many ways, while this has recognized and brought out the worst that is our human activity, it has also brought out the best, because people have come together, as we do around a crisis and around loss. It's how do you sustain that, and how do we understand today what we didn't understand? I'm hearing conversations about race now that I didn't hear before.
Good things.
And it's in many ways, it's because the as we said, this is the worst killing of police since 9/11.
Right.
You know, I'm not advocating violence by any means, but what I am saying is there was something about this moment that has made us recognize that we have a problem nationally.
Perhaps we call it a catalyst for change.
Exactly.
Okay.
But again, please, by no stretch of the imagination am I advocating violence. But I am saying that there's something about this moment that has moved us to a slightly different kind of conversation. So we are talking about racial profiling. We are talking about what can we do as a nation to heal. But one thing we have to do is to look at what brought us to the point where we are. And not that we're sort of starting from scratch and that we have a blank slate. We do not.
Dr. Neil Lester is joining me right now, one of the more respected professors in the country, foundation professor of English and director of Project Humanities. And you talk about corruption in all organizations. I know you're not just talking about law enforcement. And I think that means everything from, and correct me if I'm wrong here, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but I think that means everything from the highest levels of government right down to our offices where we play office politics.
Well, and I sort of toss that word corruption around. What I mean is misbehavior.
Okay.
People are unkind to people. And I see that at many levels. And, I do think it's unfair that when you look at the Department of Justice Ferguson report, that it's the police who get blamed for the oppression of those poor, underrepresented folks who are least able to defend themselves and to have a voice. But the municipal system was also part of that corruption in the sense that people were being charged unnecessarily. They were being ticketed. They were developing these fines that they knew they couldn't pay. And until a third party came in and revealed some of that, we wouldn't have known that. Mm-hmm. We see this, and it's not just in, the municipal system. I'm looking specifically at ways in which, we can talk about the justice system more broadly. There is no reason that we would have certain populations of people in prison more than others. There's no reason in terms of, genetically, that we should have some people getting off for rape for 4 months just because they have gone to certain institutions in this country. That whole notion of affluenza.
Right.
It's about a justice system. That's not about the police. So I'm saying that we have to take a comprehensive view and not imagining that there is a single solution to this complicated problem.
Is there a way, is this one of those deals where everything has to be done at exactly the same time or it'll never work? Or can we say, all right, let's start looking at some practices and procedures for municipal governments and flesh those out. And now let's take a look at some of these other things.
Well, we didn't get here overnight, and we're not going to get away from here overnight. So I think you're exactly right that we have to do this in phases, but everybody has to be engaged. Once upon a time, we sort of imagined that race only involved certain people. What we see now is that issues of race and the complexities of race and education and opportunities and economics involves everybody in this country. And so the potential is there for everybody to somehow own this and not just say this is a particular demographic. When we're talking about what happens in Baltimore or is happening in Baltimore with Freddie Gray, when we're talking about Mike Brown, when we're talking about Jordan Davis, and the list goes on, and now this, and now the police, we realize that this is a national problem. Mm-hmm. So in terms of whether or not we're more or less divided, to me is not the issue. The issue is what do we do now that this has happened and we see patterns of this. That's how we determine realities that move beyond perception, is by looking at the frequency of these occurrences.
That's exactly why I wanted you on the Pro Solutions. Dr. Lester, thank you so much. My time is short here, but I cannot thank you enough for what you just said, and hopefully we're able to continue the conversation here. Thank you, sir.
I hope so, and thank you so much for inviting me back to the program.
You bet, anytime. Still to come, the Veep Stakes and your thoughts on what the doctor just said. Next, Chris Merrill, News Talk 550 KFYI.